Look, I spoke to someone very senior in BBC News and he says, current affairs, mate, isn't it? It's current affairs. Now, people won't understand
I
this.
know what that means.
Yeah, exactly. So the BBC, there is BBC News, and there is a whole different department, that might as well be on another planet in a different solar system called BBC Current Affairs. And Current Affairs goes about its business. BBC News goes about its business. And BBC News is responsible for the daily news output of programmes that are on the air every single day. Current Affairs are the sort of weekly or monthly programmes or the documentaries that appear more seldom. Now, anyone working in BBC News is acutely aware of the sensitivities around reporting on an issue like Gaza and Israel. And broadly speaking, if I was to generalise, if you are pro-Palestinian, you think that the BBC is anti-Palestinian, and if you're pro-Israeli, you think that the BBC is anti-Israeli. And the BBC walks this terribly difficult tightrope, which I know that the folks who work within BBC News take incredibly seriously and are very aware of the pressures on both sides.
And I don't know about you, but when I worked there, particularly on a big breakfast show, and none of it was ever as acute as life since October the 7th, but whenever there was a big story from Israel or Gaza or the West Bank, the pressure from above internally was always very strong.
Yeah,
and it was a kind of good pressure. It was a scrutiny. Make sure that you do this. Make sure that you consider that. Have you checked this? Double check that, which is a good discipline, and it seems to have potentially anyway been lost here.
I've always said that, what we need to do is to check our facts, recheck our facts, make sure that what we're about to report withstands scrutiny. And once we've done that, we report it boldly. I think that sometimes, if I had a criticism when I was there, that sometimes it induced cowardice by you just simply say, well, this side say that side say something different, only time will tell.
And yet the reality is your job as a reporter is to establish some facts.
Exactly.
And you have to establish the rigour of the people giving you the story.
And so, of course, the producers were hamstrung by the fact that they didn't have access into Gaza. But it's apparently the person who found out that there was this link, Hamas link, was someone who just Googled it. Now, if the producers, and I don't know, I mean, I'm not, not part of the BBC anymore, but if the producers haven't done that, then there are some pretty serious questions.
It was a man called David Collier on X. I saw the investigations that he just carried out himself using his own computer at home, and off he went. Yeah.
Exactly. And if the BBC was unaware of that, that's a kind of pretty big question to answer. Now, the BBC has put out a statement saying that it maintained editorial control and, no family members could, it was editorial independence. Well, doesn't quite answer the question of whether...
Did you know who he was?
Did you know who he was or not?
I was thinking earlier on when we were talking about this, after you and I had a chat, I was thinking, this is like finding out in the 1980s, when London was being bombed, parts of Northern Ireland were being bombed by the IRA and others. This is like finding out that, unbeknownst to you, a kid in a documentary, the kid you centre the documentary around, is actually Martin McGuinness's nephew.
Yeah, and that's not a great look.
No.
And I also think that particularly in an age of disinformation and misinformation, where the BBC reputation is taken incredibly seriously by those inside the BBC. So what they did in BBC News is set up this thing called BBC Verify. And every time you watch a report on the BBC News, this is from BBC Verify, where had they verified the facts on this one? And that is a really uncomfortable question.
But if the answer is no. In your understanding of the structure inside the BBC, would BBC Verify be concerning itself mostly with BBC News?
Yes.
Rather than BBC Current Affairs?
Yes. But perception is reality. Yeah. And the problem is that I don't think, you and I, if I may be so rude as to say, are old lags from the BBC, know the distinction between BBC News and BBC Current Affairs. I think in the outside world, no one has...
Just the BBC.
It's just the BBC, and no one has any perception, and they would expect the same degree of scrutiny and scrupulous researching, whether it's a BBC News programme or BBC Current Affairs, and be aware of the sensitivities.
They'd be right to expect.
Look, I don't know the detail of this, but there is. I was just trying to explain the distinction, the structure of how this happens, which is slightly unfathomable to anyone who hasn't worked in the organisation.
And it kind of points to a kind of siloed system, doesn't it? Where we're over there doing this, you're over there doing that, never the twain shall meet. We saw that with the Newsnight stories on child abuse all those years ago, from the Savile stuff to the Lord McAlpine stuff. I can't believe this is happening again. How is this happening again? And it was that story again, wasn't it? It was that siloed thinking.
Look, there is something of the BBC as being ungovernable, which is sometimes its great strength, that different departments go off and do these amazing investigations, but at times, can damage the BBC's reputation when it gets something wrong and then finds itself having to sort of clarify or backpedal. As I say, I don't know the details of this. I've seen the statement that the BBC has put out. It doesn't quite answer the question that has been raised
of
by
the connection between the two. Yeah, but journalism's journalism, isn't it? Doesn't matter if it's happening in a newsroom like the ones you and I work in, or in the news agents is a good example. You are a daily news program, but you're not a news program in the way that, say, this one is. It's a different kind of approach, but it's the same thing. It's journalism, and it needs to be right.
And it has to be right, and we have to be able to justify what we've said, and we have to be able to look at ourselves and think, have we done the right degree of scrutiny? Have we checked this thoroughly? Does this, if you hold it up to the light...
And we can all get it wrong. Sometimes but it's about making sure that you're clear if that happens, isn't it? Should the programme still be on iPlayer, do you think?
Well, I think that's a question for the BBC. I'm not going to start opining on what should be BBC policy.
Doctor.
Look, I think there are serious questions that have been raised, and I'm sure that is being looked at.
I suppose one of the questions as well could be, leave the documentary as it is.
Then just give it the health warning.
Give it the health warning.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean,
give people insight,
give people
and context.
Yeah. Because if you haven't got that context, then you're kind of maybe getting a misleading impression. And the BBC is desperate to avoid tags that it is pro-Hamas or pro-Netanyahu. I mean, if they put out a documentary, and the corollary you've made, and it turned out that one of the kids being featured about how awful life has been in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv for the past 18 months since October the 7th, and you have in it Benjamin Netanyahu's nephew, I think the BBC would rightly come in for a right old kicking.